Hello, everybody, and welcome to our leading interview series. I'm Carol Schwartz, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to a very old friend and colleague of mine, Elana Rubin, who is probably one of Australia's most preeminent board directors. Elana has had a very, very interesting career, which we're going to hear about, and is currently the acting chair of Afterpay. She is on the board of Telstra, and she's on the board of many private organisations as well as government organisations. And we're really thrilled to have her speaking to us today. So welcome, Elana.
Thank you, Carol. It's lovely to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Can you share a little bit about your background with us and how you got on the career trajectory that you're now on?
Wow, that goes back a long, long time. I started my career in social policy and industrial relations at the ACTU. And it was during the period of the Hawke-Keating government where they involved employers and trade unions in lots of policy development, both economic policy, social policy. And I worked for Bill Kelty, who was an exceptional leader in many, many ways. But one of the things that Bill was fabulous about is supporting young executives and supporting young women. And I often talk about the importance of having a sponsor in one's career that can see things in you that you don't see yourself and can put you in situations that you normally wouldn't put yourself into. And Bill was very much that for me when, the term sponsor wasn't even used. And so I worked at the ACTU and became involved in superannuation. And I often tell the story that when I was asked to go into superannuation and do some work there, I had this sort of fight with Bill because I wanted to do some postgrad in law and he wanted me to do superannuation, and I had no idea what superannuation was, and I thought it was to be an accountant. And I said to him, I don't want to be an accountant. But I really trusted his judgment. And so I finally agreed. I put away the law books and went in and did some postgrad studies in finance and investment. And it opened up an entirely new career path for me. And I often reflect that Bill saw something in me. I really liked reform, and I had, was really committed to things around social equity and participation in communities. And he saw something in me that would respond to how to use capital markets as a source of reform, something that I would have never expected or thought of myself. And so from then, I actually moved from the ACTU to work in industry super at a time that it was just being established. And I ran the investment program at a fund that became Australian Super. And that again put me in a very different environment to what I had been used to or expected to be in, but found it fascinating. And I worked on a range of different projects from both, helping create asset classes like infrastructure, being involved in the very early days of private equity, to developing options for members to invest in that weren't available under traditional models. So it was a fabulous time for me. And from then that sort of morphed into a non-executive director career. Again, something that I never expected to be in. I wasn't at school and thinking, oh my God, I hope I get to be a non-executive director. But it's, been a fabulous journey.
So a lot of what you were involved with in the early days was actually innovation.
Yeah.
Because you were creating things out of nothing where nothing had existed before. So tell us a little bit about the importance of innovation in corporate Australia.
I think it's a really interesting perspective because when I look at the super funds, industry super, and I look at Australian super now, you know, well over $170 billion. But 20 years ago, it was a disruptor. It was a new way of creating a super fund, the industry super concept. It was just being established. It was a disruptor in all the senses to the established model. And you look at what it's become now. And I think collectively, we need to think a lot more about how we sponsor innovation, both in terms of new companies, but also trying to incorporate innovation within our existing companies. Because even if you have a look at the ASX, top ASX companies, or a better example is in America, the FANGs, Facebooks, Googles, Amazons, they are really the mainstay of the capital markets now, where, decades ago it was an entirely different sector, which just reflects what we think of disruption and innovation is actually the growth engine for economies going forward.
Is that the sort of thing that has attracted you to becoming involved with an organisation like Afterpay?
It is, and Afterpay is one of Australia's great examples of innovation and adapting a new model. It's very exciting. I think the ability to create something that hasn't been created before and develop a product that is a solution for both consumers and merchants in a way that hasn't been done before is incredibly exciting. It comes with its sort of, ups and downs, and it's very different to being in an established company. But it gives you an insight into what the future will look like. And that's an incredible privilege to be associated with.
And just going back to Australian Super, when you were the chair of Australian Super, you would have been one of the very few chairmen of, a multi-billion-dollar organisation in Australia. How did it feel being the let me call it in inverted commas the only woman in the room?
Australian Super was a fabulous experience for me, and it was an experience where I knew a number of the directors, or most of the directors, for some time, and so it was a very inclusive and belonging environment. But I was reflecting on some of the other boards that I had been on where I was the only female. And no matter how nice and inclusive my male colleagues were, and I had a couple of boards where I was the only female and the guys were just fabulous, fabulous. It's different. And it's hard to articulate why it's different, but it's almost like any, soft issue, whether it's work and family or diversity or culture or, succession plan, they suddenly belong to the female. And everything that you say has that lens of, it's the female director raising it. Where when you have more than one female, and ideally 2 and 3 and 4, it's just a view. It's not a female view. It's not the view that you have to say, otherwise it's not said. it's just a discussion around the board table. And one of the fortunate things is I had one of my earliest boards were government boards in Victoria, and the Victorian government had a deep commitment to putting women on their boards. And, you know, my first boards had a number of females on them. And so I had that environment where I could actually see in real time just the difference in the feeling and between boards that had a number of females and boards with lovely male directors, but me being the only female. And when there was more than one female, it wasn't just me being responsible for raising the issue. There were just business issues that got discussed.
Well, I think that we've all noticed that, and plus it's the amplification of the voicing of the issue. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we call these soft issues, and yet the Royal Commission discussed the issue of culture as actually the fundamental or a fundamental issue of how a company performs.
Absolutely. And I think what we used to term soft issues or, you know, non-financial issues are actually proven to be financial. You know, culture, absolute financial issue. Sustainability, absolute financial issue. Environment, absolute financial issue. Diversity. If you have a look at all the research that says diversity adds to the business outcome, it's an absolute financial issue, and yet we still refer to the non-financial issues. So we still have a way to go.
Absolutely. When will we learn? So, Elana, do you have any strong views about talking about financial issues, about the early access to superannuation that the government has brought in during this pandemic time?
I do. I think it's not something that I would encourage for a number of reasons. And if you have a look at women's financial security, it's already more precarious than their male colleagues. You know, women's earnings are less than men. They're more likely to be in part-time roles than full-time roles. They're more likely to have gaps in employment due to caring responsibilities. And as a consequence, they already retire with less superannuation savings than their male colleagues. To take superannuation out, to take $20,000 out of your savings means that you miss compounding over time. And as you know, compounding is one of those magic things in investing.
And it's like exponential growth of viruses.
That's right. You know, compounding happens when you don't even know it.
Yeah.
And when you take money out early, if a 25-year-old was to take all their $20,000 out now, that would be approximately $90,000 worse off when they get to retirement. So at any age, if you take out the money from your super, you're taking out far more than $20,000. You're taking out that compounding effect over time. And so while I certainly appreciate that there is a financial strain on many women during this time, access to super has a long-term detrimental impact on your retirement savings. And we already know that middle-aged women are the fastest growing group of homelessness in Australia, because there is such an impact either through the lack of superannuation, you know, loss of jobs, change in family circumstances, that means many women find themselves financially vulnerable in their later years.
I mean, I think it's a big decision for everyone. I'm not sure how that particular issue's going, whether people are accessing their super to the extent that the government thought they would be.
I think there's been significant numbers accessing. what I haven't seen yet is a demographic breakdown, either by age or gender.
Elana, I think as women business leaders, we've all had interesting encounters with the media. I just wondered whether you felt that the media treats men and women business leaders differently.
I do think it treats women leaders differently to male leaders. And I think the media in many cases is a reflection of the unconscious bias that still exists in society, and the rules are different. When I started in my career, the media used to portray superwomen, and, they were perfect. They were perfectly groomed. They could, create a 5-course meal just as they rushed out of the boardroom, and, their children were perfect. Their partners were perfect. And it was a benchmark that really meant you can only participate in the higher echelons if you're truly exceptional. And it meant that there was not a realistic role model for younger women coming in. So, I remember rallying against this concept of superwomen and telling, younger women there is no such thing. We all make compromises. We can only be in one place at one time. And no one is perfect. We'll all make slips. And I think over time the media has reduced the sort of superwoman concept, but they still have this concept about women needing to prove themselves. And it's often said that when a male leader walks into a room, we all assume he's competent, but when a female leader walks into a room, we're waiting for her to prove she's competent. And it's a very different dynamic. And I think too often the media reflects that. And so while, we no longer put women on this pedestal of being a superwoman, we still want to make sure that she's competent, and we still want to test that in a way that we don't with male leaders. So if there is any slip or perceived failure, for a female, the fall is much, much harder. It's almost like we thought we could trust you, but we can't. And so therefore there's a punishment. And that punishment can be, very unfair portrayals and profiles in the media, which go way beyond the perceived transgression or perceived slip. It can mean the lack of future employment or roles. It can also mean that the messaging to other women is it's very, very risky, perhaps don't go there. And that, I think, is really unfortunate because we're closing off this pipeline of talent, either for very senior roles because, some women just don't want that exposure and the perceived risk. And also women, we talked about innovation. There's a risk in being in innovative organisations. Not everything's guaranteed to work. And I fear that women will step back from some of those more innovative-oriented companies, those high growth, those startups, because the perceived risk of failure for women is far greater than for men. I don't know. How do you find it?
Oh, well, you've just expressed that absolutely brilliantly. I mean, particularly in relation to early stage entrepreneurial companies. I mean, women seem to be totally lambasted for, failure in an entrepreneurial business, but that's the nature of entrepreneurship. You try things, some work, some don't work. And, you just got to get up, brush yourself off and go forward with the next opportunity. But unfortunately, it seems to me that women tend to get absolutely slammed and also take it much more personally and to heart than men do. And for men, it almost seems like it's part of the rite of passage. But for women, it's not accepted as a rite of passage.
I think that's absolutely spot on. And the other thing that I find with the media is if a man, is involved in something that hasn't worked, or, there's been a perceived failure, that's his to own. But for a woman, it brings down the whole gender. So, how many articles do you read that, sort of a female chair or senior director has been associated with a failure? Will that mean that women won't be appointed? So every woman has to have the weight of responsibility of their entire gender when they make a decision. Do I take this or don't I take this? And I think that's just so unfair.
That's absolutely right. So, Elana, how would you suggest women deal with those sorts of issues with the media? I mean, do we just ignore it or do we take it seriously? I mean, how do we deal with that?
I think it's a mix. There is certainly something about just remembering your self-worth and what you actually bring to either the executive role or the board table. And as I've found, and you've been a key part of this for me during my career, having a network of colleagues that, you can get advice from, that will give you honest feedback, that you can test approaches with, I have found invaluable. And, you've been a great source of that for me over my career. That network of support, which, again, men grow up with, because they're always assumed that they would be in some, leadership role. Women, we need to create that. And, I would certainly encourage all women to have that. As I found, in my very early stages of my career, but also throughout, having a sponsor or more than one sponsor is also incredibly valuable. That can, act as your advocate when you're not in the room and, put things in balance and perspective for you. And as you've been a strong advocate for, we need to ensure that the media starts to have greater diversity of leaders in their profiles. So we will stop having women singled out when we have a critical mass of women, where they're no longer an exception, they're no longer unusual, they're no longer something that needs to be commented on. When we have a true critical mass, then essentially the noise, in my mind, will stop. And that's what we need to aspire to collectively.
Elana, last question. I always like to ask people that I'm speaking to what they're reading at the moment. Are you reading anything other than about COVID or Trump?
Well, I am actually. I've got Paul Krugman's book on my bedside table that I'm just about to start, because he writes so well about economics and the American economy. I'm just about to start Malcolm Turnbull's book, having just finished something very eclectic, or not eclectic, different, having just finished Elton John's autobiography.
Right.
And I love it. I love reading about people, Elton John, someone who can hear things that nobody else can and is sort of driven to use his talent. Or, people who create things that nobody has before, whether it's art or, Phil Knight at Nike, Michelle Obama, read her book, and someone who is driven to make an impact. So I've just finished those. And I also have been carrying Trent Dalton's book around for quite some time, but I haven't started it.
Well, you should start that one first. It's an absolute beauty. That's Boy Swallows Universe, yes? Yeah, it's a fabulous book. Enjoy it. Elana, thank you so much. That's been such a fabulous conversation.
Oh, thank you, Carol, for the opportunity. I always love talking to you on anything.
And I love talking to you too. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.